All right, since we have already a somewhat full house, I'm going to go ahead and get started with welcomes and introductions. And I'll kind of drag out my introduction so that stragglers have a couple of minutes to sign in and get comfortable and get comfy for the upcoming talk. My name is Eliza Rose. I teach here at UNC in the Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literatures Department. I teach East and Central European Studies, looking at Polish and Jewish and East European culture from the 20th century. I'm currently teaching a course for the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies that is very, very intimately tied with the talk we're going to hear tonight. And I see my students in the audience, so thanks to those of you out there for coming. And I think we'll all have a lot of exciting ideas about the talk ahead. I am super excited to introduce our speaker for tonight. Our speaker is Elena Torres, who is an assistant professor of comparative literature at the University of Chicago. Torres's forthcoming book is titled Horizons Blossom, Borders Vanish, Anarchism and Yiddish Literature, and this is forthcoming from Yale University Press. I'm so excited for that book. This project examines the literary production, language politics, and religious thought of Jewish anarchist movements from 1870 to the present in Moscow, Tel Aviv, London, Buenos Aires, and New York City. Torres co-edited Freedom's Fullness, Histories of Jewish Anarchism, together with labor historian Kenyon Zimmer, and that was published by Illinois University Press, or it will be published by Illinois University Press in 2022. Torres has also recently co-edited a special issue of Ingeweb on the Polish poet, philosopher, and art critic Devorah Fogel, who I think we'll be hearing about a bit tonight. And this issue is freshly out with Ingeweb. I recommend everybody check it out. Torres's writing has also appeared in Nashim, Ingeweb, Jewish Quarterly Review, the anthology Feminisms in Motion, A Decade of Intersectional Feminist Media from AK Press, and elsewhere. Torres has also worked as a muralist, organizer, and set designer. So I'm incredibly excited for tonight's talk, which is titled Radical Stillness, Reading Velocity in Yiddish and Anti-Fascist Poetics. This is the Morris, Ida, and Alan Heilig Lecture at the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. So thanks to the whole team at the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, Karen Gajewski, Andrea and Talia, for helping us get this event off the ground, and thanks to everybody in the audience. During the talk, if you don't mind just placing any questions that come up in the chat, and feel free to put anything there. You could discussion, or if there's something you'd like to hear clarified or hear more context on, please feel free to flag that in the chat as well, and I'll be keeping track of that. And at the very end of the talk, I'll be opening up the floor to discussion, and I'll have a chance to discuss more. So with no further ado, Anna, you have the floor. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Eliza Rose, for the invitation to speak with your class, which has been focusing on Ashkenazi avant-gardes this year. And thank you to Karen Gajewski for your administrative work. It's really good to be here with you today from the south side of Chicago. And I know that students in Professor Rose's class have been studying some of my writing on the Soviet Yiddish poet, critic, and anti-fascist organizer, Peretz Markish. I've been writing and translating the work of Markish for about a decade now, along with that of the Polish Yiddish poet and art critic, Devorah Fogel. And as Professor Rose mentioned, this week a special issue came out that tries to focus on some of the new contributions, both scholarly and artistic, by Devorah Fogel. So although Peretz Markish, the Soviet writer, and Devorah Fogel, the Polish writer, were not directly in conversation with one another in the 1920s and 1930s, to me, these writers have represented the two poles in how I think about questions of anti-fascism in Yiddish modernism, and particularly questions of the significance of dynamism and mobility, the representation of speed, mechanization, industrialization. And so I'm taking this talk as an opportunity to read with the work of Fogel at the center in conversation with two other Yiddish modernists, tracing how Fogel's theorization of stillness and stasis and her political critique of nationalism might open up new resonances with other Yiddish modernists' work. My aim is to make explicit in how we think through ways that in the midst of war, in the midst of forced migration and mechanical acceleration, poets of the transnational Yiddish avant-garde were theorizing non-mobility. By placing stillness at the center of a project, we can reveal the poet's concern with domesticity and the critique of war and nationalism, and try to loosen some of this very tight association between speed and velocity and the aesthetic aims of 20th century modernism. So what is the stakes here? Why is it important to consider stillness as an aesthetic in Yiddish leftist modernism? What are the stakes of this question? In thinking about this, I'm really inspired by the work of a Black feminist poet named Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who writes that, quote, modernity depends on the valorization of mobility and the new, noting that this valorization is, quote, masculinist and represents an under-theorization of reproduction and reproductive labor. So despite the difference in subjectivity between the Caribbean poets studied and emulated by Alexis Pauline Gumbs and the world of the Polish and Yiddish avant-garde, I think this question of why stillness resonates across time and space. How are diaspora and mobility gendered? How are expectations of speed? What expectations does that have about the human body? In Yiddish literary studies, much attention has been paid to travel narratives, discussions of migration, which center the figure who moves. And this can reveal a tendency to make most noble the work of male intellectuals, thinking about their movement, their migrations, while obscuring other forms of reproductive labor, especially representations of domestic labor by women poets. So I'm going to begin with reading Devorah Fogel, and I shall try to share my screen here. Yes. All right, so hopefully you can see, yes, you can see this portrait. So here we have a photograph of Devorah Fogel and her portrait by the artist Vitkevitz from 1929 and 1930. So begin with Fogel. She was born in 1900 in Berstein, which is now Ukraine. She was raised in a Polish-speaking home. Her father taught her Hebrew, and she began publishing articles on art history in Swedish, Polish, and Hebrew journals at the age of 18. So she was really a polyglot and quite prodigious. Although she knew several European languages and Semitic languages as well, she chose to write in Yiddish for her most experimental compositions, publishing 2 books of Yiddish poetry, one in 1930 and one in 1934, and a book of prose montages titled Acacias blien, or Acacias are blooming, in 1935, which she translated into Polish herself. She studied philosophy in Vienna, Polish literature in Krakow, and philosophy in Lviv. After writing a dissertation on the influence of Hegel's aesthetics on Yosef Kramer, she then taught psychology at a Hebrew teachers' college. She was known as a very charismatic figure in the Polish avant-garde, and her art criticism responded to the work that was being created in her circle, including that of Marc Chagall and Henrik Streng, who illustrated her book. Despite considerable social and financial obstacles, Fogel wrote some of the most theoretically complex work published in Yiddish. In 1930, Fogel met a then unpublished school teacher named Bruno Schulz, who then went on to become a wildly famous 20th century Polish modernist writer. And Schulz and Fogel developed a deep relationship on their Sunday walks, which their mutual friend, the writer Rachel Auerbach, described as, quote, philosophical conversations of a very high level, which nonetheless at times turned into mischievous scenes. Schultz composed a series of letters to Fogel. Their postscripts, titled Stories About My Father, describe Schultz's town Drohobitz through the eyes of a child. Fogel encouraged Schultz to continue the project, and these postscripts form the basis of Cinnamon Shops, Schultz's book of startling, metaphorically dense short stories published in 1934. The same year that Fogel published Mannequinen, or Mannequins, a collection of her Yiddish poetry. Common images and impressions resonate back and forth between Schultz and Fogel's work: blooming acacias, the brightly colored flower, strangely covered pavements, mannequins in tailors' shops, encounters with uncanny-faced men, urban spaces that are doubled over and bent around. Reading the work of Fogel and Schultz in close succession is akin to overhearing a call and response, two voices conversing in a strange shared world. However, Schultz did not read Yiddish or Hebrew, and so there's some new contemporary work coming out by Karen Underhill that looks particularly at the philosophical influence of Fogel upon Schultz, because it was he was restricted in what Jewish languages he had access to. And here is a new monument to Fogel, which is a multilingual monument that was put up in Lviv by the Center for Urban History. So now I'd like to consider some of the relationships between the representation of speed and visual art for Fogel. Using poetic strategies of repetition, montage, and stasis, Fogel developed a unique style of writing, both poetry and prose, informed by unist and constructivist visual art. She applied methods informed by cubism, constructivism, unism, and surrealism to unexpected objects and gazes within her poetry: the world viewed from a commuter train, orange soda in a glass, shop mannequins in a window. These are the images that are repeated and refracted across her work. A theorist of stillness, unenthralled with modernist philosophy, Fogel writes in her 1931 prose piece, The Building of the Train Station, which is translated by Anastasia Lyubas. Fogel writes, quote, "There's a lot of space in the world, needless, helpless space. Oh, space that is flat and slow, boring like a large board floor, scrubbed with lye, like the circular landscape of a calendar Sunday that features people who have misplaced their fate, even if only for a few hours. They go for a stroll. Oh, we need to reduce the needless length of the world by 1/3 or even 1/2. But the steps drag the round weight of the world a few feet further. They drag the naked matter with its lost cause of life, with the second unknown matter of death. Let us stand still, like trees. Trees know nothing of fear or death. Trees live as if inside the four gray, sweet walls, as if the reduced space of a street or a room. Let us build train stations, stations with parallel rails embracing the world. Stations divide all the world into distance." And here we have one image, and you can see the wall around the tree. This image emulating not the velocity or the innovation of trains, but rather focusing on the tree that stands still, and not even a tree in nature or a tree in space, but a tree within the city, as we see here behind the wall. And this is one illustration from Fogel's work. Fogel calls us to stand still like trees, to become witnesses of modernism rather than to become passengers. This devalorization of the machine and of geographic space marks much of Fogel's work. The poem Circular Landscape, from the same collection in 1934, exemplifies Fogel's approach to domesticity, materiality, production, and reproduction. She writes, in my translation, and here is the poem Keilchdicke Landschaft, Circular Landscapes. Quote, In houses as angular as refusal, pale and watery whitewashed kitchens, brass basins of oranges become ripe, blue oblong pots of plums, bottles as cool as lemons, quiet glasses open resigned bodies to dreamy foreign land tea, and coffee that's as hard as refusal. Outside, circular streets pass by, wagons carry sweet white milk in canisters, and breasts with sweet milk, unneeded, bend over gray sweet canisters. Suburban streets open window shutters with tin kerosene cans, silvery round, and herring barrels, plump, rotund, and sacks of unbleached flour and brown kasha. And on sidewalks and squares, circular hats rock and bob on dark gentlemen. Men have somewhere squandered their fate and go out walking. What is longing? What is refusal? Was ist Bänkschaft? Was ist Obsog? So if we can visualize this poem, right, as though it were a painting, it would probably look somewhat like a cubist painting, right? Because the frame of it, Fogel collapses multiple sightlines. We have both interior and exterior space. The street and the kitchen collide, industry, the external world, and mother's milk, the internal world of the body. Here, Fogel applies a highly refined experimental aesthetic, not to the city or the metropolis or the train, but to the domestic tableau. Time is rendered full and simultaneous, a practice that Fogel identifies in her critical essays as the principle of simultaneity or simultaneism, which is a key element in her theory of stasis and montage. Hers is a poetics of expectancy, repetition, montage, and myth. Indeed, her manifestos hail, quote, the specific beauty of objectivity. By inverting the process of production and reproduction, the mother's breast is both de-eroticized and rendered surplus. Her face is unseen in this poem, and the baby is absent. When no infant suckles, a parent's body stops producing milk. Here, the baby has been replaced by gray sweet bottles. The mother's body is stationary in the posture of the labor of nursing. So the mother remains static. She doesn't move, but she's orbited by milk wagons, presumably driven by delivery men. The relation between internal domestic stasis and industrial mobility is further heightened by the consumption of Fremdländischen Tee, hazy foreign land tea, which sits on their table. Here, household materials become animate, troubling the hierarchy presumed between body and machine. Compare this poem to Streng's painting, Street, and we see a similar approach to the representation of urban space as simultaneous. So if you can look at this painting from 1924, which is presented as with Fogel presents the domestic tableau, quite flat, and the figures are rendered in silhouette here. The composition of the human body is in profile, almost like an Egyptian tomb, right? We see their movement is quite static, and everything is happening all at once. There's no sense of depth perspective. Everything is presented in the intersection of this single plane. Fogel's aesthetic, yes, and another example of montage in which the plurality of sightlines in a city becomes completely simultaneous, as though you can see down every street from the same vantage point. Fogel's aesthetic theory and practice were prescient of major developments in European and US feminist art. Her approach anticipated the post-war emergence of experimental representations of domestic temporality and women's labor, exemplified by films of Chantal Akerman and Trin Minha. These techniques include Fogel's closely observed representation of women's material world, her satire of predetermined scripts, especially the dialogue of romance, and the practice of what Alexis Pauline Gumbs calls the radical inhabitation of stillness. Fogel renders the interiors occupied by women from bodegas to bordellos with a politicized attentiveness to material detail. Her verse captures the fraught relation between women and commodity, critiquing the objectification of the body wrought by capitalism without disavowing the pleasure of kitsch and consumption. Woven throughout Fogel's analysis of political economy are litanies of dresses and fabrics cataloged with both specificity and delight. Fogel's principle of simultanism expands the single visual field to include the commodified person alongside that which she desires. Though she diverges from orthodox Marxist views of commodity and value, both the laboring woman and the commercial object possess inherent worth preceding exchange value, which remains located within their very materiality. Her poetry theorizes domesticity, economics, and the material realm, playing the scales between all of these registers. Another key aspect of Fogel's thought on montage is how she theorizes montage as a form uniquely capable of representing life. Particularly interested in photomontage, which she wrote about in a number of essays. Montage is a way of negotiating urban space with multiple prefabricated perspectives. As Martino Stierli writes in Montage in the Metropolis, quote, montage is defined by heterogeneity or plurality of the image. Whole reproduced images or their parts are juxtaposed and then brought into productive, at times dialectical relationship. Fogel's 1937 article, The Literary Genre of Montage, begins, quote, montage is more than a form experiment. It is a necessary expression of a worldview. Fogel cites the Polish writer Mieczysław Szewczuka's definition of montage as, quote, simultaneity of the multitude in space. This technique dissolves difference within the simultaneous moment. Fogel writes, quote, the logic of montage is ultimately that of the bringing together of situations, their exemplification is seen from a particular standpoint. This principle allows for the combination of two scenes in the framework of one totality, such as soldiers marching in a completely regular right-angle column and flower shops with fully blooming azaleas. The logic of this is the fact of perfection, which proclaims an odd yearning for peace and a fresh beginning. And here's another image by Henrik Streng, referring perhaps to this model of simultaneity, which Fogel is perfecting. And here we have the regularity, right, of the columns of the faceless marching army. And then in the upper left quadrant, this explosion of blooms. And they exist in perfect relation to each other, right, in this static relation. Simultanism and montage encompass both unruly biology and disciplined bodies, as we see here with the soldiers marching in formation past azaleas in their riot. The phrase, an odd yearning for peace, gestures towards the synthesis of all of these elements within its totality. And we can see here how montage is particularly well suited for representing the multilingual, multicultural city. Now consider as well Fogel's description of the train, which we see in the opening poem, in which she takes the futurist machine and inverts it into a vehicle for the female gaze. As the train passes by all of these houses, the passengers look into the kitchens, describing the pots and pans seen inside of these women's homes. And I find this a really fascinating innovation and reversal, this collapse of inside and outside space, this kind of intervention into modernist poetry about speed and industry, because here it's really a domestication of the external world placed in relation to the internal space of the kitchen. And it reminds me as well of the later Jewish Belgian author Chantal Akerman, whose, quote, use of what is traditionally called dead time, in which supposedly nothing happens, raises questions about what nothing happening might mean in the lives of women steeped in domestic drudgery. In Fogel's montages, the ceaseless condition of nothing happening is put into relation with grand events, military parades and revolutions, forcing us to view domestic non-event as occurring within objective simultaneity. So here I want to return to this question of, and what are the political stakes of Fogel's theory? What really is the significance of this centering of stillness? In her essay, Stasis, Dynamics, and Contemporaneity in Art, Fogel discusses class explicitly and rejects the idea that dynamic art is more revolutionary. Quote, today one identifies dynamic art with the social, the revolutionary, and in turn with the proletarian, which must be relevant to the contemporary social order. This is not the place to analyze that perpetually vague, not at all easy definition of the concept of proletarian art. Lest her refusal to endorse or define proletarian art be viewed as reactionary, consider the 1938 Montage military parade. Unlike many of her poems, Fogel here begins in a specific time and place. Quote, on one of the last days of February in the year 1937, in expressionless Lychakovsky Street, precisely at the point where it joins around Bernardine Place. Fogel continues, quote, from the bright and gentle blueness, the very heart of first spring blueness, soldiers and tanks advance. Self-evident, like everything that happens on that day. There come tank houses, flat as fields. The leather of helmets and jackets is like iron, so smooth and luminous, freed from the caprices of fold and pleat. So too are the people dressed in leather jackets and helmets, without the folds of caprice. From the field of spring color, soldiers emerge into view. The Yiddish phrase Onknechen von Caprisen, without the whimsy or caprice of folds, links gendered clothing and affect, since connection means both the folds or wrinkles of a garment and the nuance of interpretation or expression. Thus, without feminine ruffles and pleats, which is a very striking way to describe a soldier, right? Describing the uniform by how it's not feminine. Here, the soldiers are lacking both femininity and lacking nuance. Fogel begins from the realm of the material, framing military ostentation within a domestic subjectivity. This passage describing the marching of soldiers is filled with unexpected sensorial descriptions of military display, beginning with the ironic portmanteau tank house, which domesticates instruments of war, a shocking image of how war literally comes home. Observing the texture of soldiers' uniforms places these figures in a plane of materiality before ideology. Women, quote, in shining porcelain dresses, and, quote, a gentleman with a thin, helpless smile, contrived for a lady in elastic blue, talking about the first drawn-out agonies. So here we have this image, this very feminine image, right, attending to the clothing of the soldiers, that opens the tableau, that opens the this montage. And then the montage of military parade ends inside of this domestic scene. Quote, in the house late at night, an open newspaper lies with a red banner headline, Europe burns, a banal sentence. Tin rises in price, lead rises in price, zinc one can substitute with man-made material. A spring day, one of the first, expires, gentle and elastic, full with portents and expectations. One awaits banal things, the fresh greenness that floods the sidewalk, suddenly and without anyone having hoped for it. One waits for gray, light-warmed asphalt and porcelain with which streetlights are lit, later to burn with a honey gold, self-absorbed light, the light of Claude Lorrain's paintings. And that's how the scene of the military parade ends, with a newspaper folded on the kitchen table. In this montage of the military parade, Fogel applies the technique of stasis and simultaneity in a particularly devastating way. Men's lives struggle upwards, aufsteigen, during wartime, which parallels the verb used to describe the price of material rising. She also uses the word steigen, making soldiers' bodies commodities within the same market reported on in the newspaper. The banal script recited between men and women are no longer romantic dialogue, but the rhetoric of war. Ultimately, the Yiddish urban montage also raises questions about the precarity of Jewish space within the city. As Fogel wrote in 1931 in a letter to Bruno Schulz, quote, it is quite good to be hopelessly left to the mercy of abandonment and hopelessness. It is then that one can truly see. Fogel's modeling of stasis becomes key to her Poetics of refusal. Through this radical inhabitation of stillness and practice of stasis, Fogel makes these women's experiences of occupation and reproductive labor visible within the Yiddish landscape. When Alexis Pauline Gumbs calls on us to listen closely to the paralysis we perpetuate when we use diaspora in a way that reproduces a gendered valorization of mobility, she also speaks to the erasure of reproductive labor within scholarship. By making stasis central, Fogel incidentally reveals how deeply the male experience of modernist mobility became embedded within a modernist aesthetics. Through this radical inhabitation of stillness, Fogel marks women's experiences in reproductive labor into the Yiddish modernist landscape and extends an invitation to read other poets with an ear for their refusal of dynamism as well. And here I want to also spotlight these series of 3 murals which appeared in Berlin by Ella Ponizowski-Bergelsen in the spring of 2021, which translate Fogel, who spoke more than 4 languages and more than 4, into German, English, Arabic, and the original Yiddish, and consider some of the ways in which Montage appears here as well in these projects. And we can talk a little more about contemporary responses to Fogel, ways of bringing Fogel into the metropolis and thinking about Montage in the living city today. But I want to bring these images in as well to show the kind of persistence and reinvention of Fogel's aesthetic. And now turning from the austere poetry and theory of Devorah Fogel, I want to consider the archetypal dynamism of Peretz Markish. And as I said at the beginning, reading and translating and kind of living with Fogel's voice in my head for so many years has led me to reconsider some of the centering of a futurist aesthetic, particularly with Markish, but also to seek within his work and the work of other Jewish modernist poets some of the other forms of movement which are not purely dynamic, not hailing velocity at its center, but might still be euphoric, not only stillness, but other ways that Yiddish modernism represents and hails how the body moves outside of machine time. So here we have the very beautiful face of Peretz Markish, who is in some ways a very archetypal Yiddish anti-fascist writer. He was born in Polon, Volhynia, and he was a very prolific writer and very charismatic performer of his poetry. There are countless descriptions of his hair, his hands, his voice, his stage presence in those who came to see him read in Warsaw and Moscow and Poland and the provinces. And the persona that Markish fashioned, both linguistically and sartorially, was very much inspired by Mayakovsky in his brashness and his flamboyance. But after this brash early period of writing for the avant-garde journals in Kiev and Warsaw, Markish in later decades turned to compose odes to Soviet power. In the early 1940s, the communist critic Alexander Pomerantz called Markish's poetry, quote, a splendid weapon. Markish was no common warrior of the pen, but a Pavlichenko sniper, comparing Markish's virtuosity to the famed Red Army sniper Ludmila Pavlichenko, who had 300 confirmed kills. So here I want to think about some of the ways in which Markish's work was framed as anti-fascist and what was being centered when anti-fascism was discussed in the scholarship. Pomerantz, the one who called Markish a Pavlichenko sniper of the pen, had lived in the Soviet Union from 1933 until 35 and remained a member of the American Communist Party until 1950. Pomerantz praises Markish's range, referencing his collection Atoit to Kannibalen, Death to the Cannibals, published in Moscow in 1941. Quote, the theme, the ideas, the content and style of the poems is death to the fascist cannibals. intensify our hatred, awaken our fury against the cannibals, and strengthen love for the Red Army, for Moscow, for wounded Red Army fighters, for Soviet land, for the Polish partisan, for all anti-fascist fighters. Despite the heaven-wailing, shuddering description of the fascist cannibal, Markish does not despair. Pomerantz echoes Markish's own prose style when he writes these reviews. Quote, Markish's hatred for the cannibals of fascism is borderless. His love for the anti-fascist fighter is also without border, with borderless love for the winged anti-fascist fighters. His courage is higher than the stars. And actually, when I look at reviews of Markish, it's very common that Markish's style was completely contagious, and his reviewers, including Pomerantz, take up these symbols and terms and try to kind of write like Markish, even as they're praising and critiquing his work. But while Pomerantz bestows very high praise on Markish's later heroic Soviet verse, he also disdains the anarchism of Markish's early period and casts it as a kind of regrettable or embarrassing phase. Pomerantz writes that during his years in Kiev, Markish composes, quote, a whole line of rebellious abstract poetry and arrives with wandering motifs and cosmic motifs and expresses the tumult of revolution. Here they come to express the atmosphere of the petty bourgeois stratum that have reacted to the revolution in an anarchist manner. Certainly in the book Stam, Ordinary, Markish tried to touch directly on the October Revolution, but here as well, he remains further from any abstract or truly inspired song of praise. Markish had not grasped the strengths and aims of the revolution at that time. So here Alexander Pomerantz is dismayed by the first-person voice of Markish's early work. Quote, carefree, aimless. This is Markish's slogan. Significantly, what Pomerantz criticizes here about Markish's avant-garde literary production is related to the quality of its movement, the quality of its dynamism, its disinterest in hailing a heroic male body that charges unidirectionally through space, but rather it gestures, dances, and dissolves into air. As Markish wrote in 1919, my body is sea foam and reeks of wind. Mein Guff ist Schäum und se schmeckt von ihm mit Wind. This is a body that comes and then vanishes. Pomerantz hints, in other words, at the potential unruliness of stillness or undirected dynamism. In other words, in the poem's refusal to march. In 1919, Markish published the collection Schwellen, Thresholds, in Kiev. Its cover and frontispiece are designed by Yosef Chaikov, who later illustrated the second cover of De Coupe, Markish's expressionist elegy for pogrom victims. 1 year after Klay's Angel of History, this very famous painting, which Walter Benjamin writes about and owned, Chaikov's figure descends from a cloud, or perhaps ascends from the angular shtetl rooftops below. Framed by an arch, this figure gestures with a delicate hand to forehead and a beam of light refracted in the other palm. Its grimacing face is flanked by long, dark sidelocks or payas. Its narrow chest, slim hips, and muscular thighs emerge from a cloud. Their feet are dancing. Is this an angel descending, woe-stricken by the humanity it finds? Or is this an androgynous Jew rising to heaven from a humble village? The interplay of Markish's poetic voice across futurist, romantic, and folkloric forms is reflected in these illustrations by Chaikov, which alternate between tensely drawn figures and languorous lovers bent together in the field, arch-backed horses, and gestural blooms. The mysterious landscape on its cover reflects Schwellen's saturation with images of time, fields, horses, and the cosmos. Looking at the cover illustration by Chaikov, when I was over the summer at the New York Public Library and got to see this edition in person, I kept trying to mimic its posture. It's very hard to do this position, especially in a crowded reading room in an archive. And so when the librarian came over to see what was happening as I tried to figure out the exact posture of this dancer, then all the librarians came over and also tried to mimic it, to understand what the symbolism of this dance pose might be. But here I want to emphasize both the question of suspension of movement and dance here, which reflects how Markish's poetic voice also relates to this question of stillness. For Markish, the body is always dissolving into a state of bliss, or it's on the verge of dissolving into the state of bliss, unarmed, unarmored, and preferably barefoot, as we see in Tchaikov's illustration. I translate from the poem Erd, which means earth. Komm raus mit mir in Feld, mein Bruder, ein allein. Tu sich borfies ois de Erd mit deine Fies grob, und los auf dir a Regen gehen. Trink sich on mit Regensaat und fall zu der Erd, a feuchte, frische Blatt. Come with me to the field, my brother, alone. Strip barefoot, dig the earth with your feet, let it thrill you, drink rain to satisfaction, and fall to the earth, a moist, fresh leaf. Undo your shirt and drop your body to the body of the earth, and remain with her. Come out with me, brother, gleam with beauty in hot midday, wander in fresh night, wallow in the world, and holler, wide field, wide field. The poetic speaker here invites their brother reader to join them and dally in the fields, grow dissolute in spring. The invocation of a wide field is a set Slavic phrase, mimicking the cadence of folk song. At its conclusion, the speaker declares a unity of themselves, their art, and the world. Quote, I am the earth myself, I am the field myself, I am the song myself, and I descend in a cloudburst of myself alone. I burst and I bury. This descent in a cloudburst, a ropgen, is perhaps represented again here by Tchaikov's liminal figure on the cover, feet dancing on earth, hands beaming light, a cloud preserving its modesty. Markish writes also in 1919 in Dreußen, quote, Herumgappen mir wild sich alle kie, und legen sich mit See auf der Erd, und röven gleich mit See. I will embrace all the cows, and lay with them upon the earth, and bellow along with them. The poet here rejects the style, the posture of high modernism, claiming that they're no more artfully a singer than barnyard animals, and embraces cows and earth together, taking up this folkloric ballad form. This blissful union with nature and stilling of the mind persists throughout Markish's literary phases. During his years in the mountains of the Caucasus, while he was in exile, Markish composed the ecologically detailed collection Yerusha, Inheritance, published in 1948, long after some critics considered him, quote, no longer modern or no longer a modernist due to his communist affiliation. Yet in the poem Evening Walk, Markish's radical ecological vision emerges. The poetic speaker goes out strolling when he has a sublime encounter, as Mary Schulman translates, quote, on an evening stroll amid the noises of the street, a butterfly flies toward me, lands upon my heart. From where comes such a pleasant, such a welcome guest? And why so late? See night's already falling. The darkness all around us spreads its borders. The stars light up one another and then fall. Only I with my welcome guest beside me go strolling in the street as with a bride. A trolley passing by waves to us hurrah. An omnibus sends us a rain of fireworks. Where do you order me to go, my guest, for this short while? Perhaps, my guest, you'll rest just for a moment. As if spellbound, we too continue strolling, but we don't let ourselves be lulled to sleep. Then with the slightest buzz, as if through tissue paper, my guest, ready to take flight, spreads out its wings, and through their transparency shows me what's beyond, where the heavens are melting, golden hued and clear, for all the summer songbirds are already there. Only you, my guest, are missing from the choir. So this poem, which is one of the last ones published during his lifetime, before his arrest and eventual execution in 1952, this late poem is really a romance. The poet walks dazzled like a groom with his bride. Banan spazieren lo sich gas wie mit a kale. The poet is walking and this butterfly has settled on his chest. The speaker reaches a Blakean revelation of infinity through contemplation of the butterfly's translucent wings. He serves his guest hospitably, speaking to the butterfly as her submitting companion. Where do you order me to go, my guest? The inventions of humanity hail them. Streetcars, fireworks move by, as with Fogel, where the speaker's body remains, and mechanization velocity is something that happens at a static distance. The poetic speaker says, quote, beside me, their proud union, ephemeral, vorbeigehensig, as it is, brings a form of revelation. The poetic speaker is the groom of nature. He enters the world of the butterfly and looks back at the human world through its veil. In another poem published in 48, Markish, titled Selbstvergessung, or Self-Oblivion, Markish sings of the orchestra of animals, cicadas playing cymbals, cuckoo birds and nightingales, the smith worm hammering. Amid this cacophony of joy, Markish asks, why then should not a man give up his bounty when every living thing gives of itself with bliss? Is wie soll der Mensch nicht abgeben sein Gob, wie et wieder balchai mit chedve git sich up? Here Markish chooses Loshen Kodesh, or Aramaic and Hebrew words, to link balcha, animal, and chedve with joy, underscoring a connection between delight and creation. The voices of all beings fill to brimming the entire world with sound, the entire world with gold. This walking together that Markish heralds is a site of freedom, not, as the anarchist theorist Kathy Ferguson writes about other forms of walking, not the confined pacing of prisoners, nor the fleeing of refugees, nor the striding of armies. No, no messianic future need be summoned when Eden can be entered through the movement of one's present, not by marching, but by strolling. So that is some of the ways in which reading Fogel has made me reconsider movement and dynamism in Markish. And for the third and final poet, which we'll look at today in relation to this question of the aesthetic of stillness in relation to anti-fascist poets, is the writer best known, well, she published her poetry as Anna Margolin, born Rosa Lebensbaum. And Margolin moved in both anarchist and suffragist worlds, as some radical women did, occupying that space in the Venn diagram. Lebensbaum, or Margolin, was born in Brisk, Lithuania in 1887. She immigrated to New York in 1906 at the age of 19, where she worked within the circles of predominantly male literary intelligentsia. She wrote for the press as a translator. She reported from Europe on movements for women's suffrage. She edited the anarchist paper Freie Arbeiterstimme, or Free Voice of Labor, for 6 months, and she contributed to socialist newspapers as well. So she occupied spaces across the world of the intellectual left. And I recommend Ayala Brin's work. Brin has an article recently on Margolin as a journalist. Interestingly, Fogel read Margolin's work and likely translated it into Polish for the Polish press, but I have not seen in Margolin's archive accounts of her reading Fogel. I don't know whether this was a mutual, if they were reciprocal readers, but Fogel was reading and translating Margolin. Another interesting aspect of Margolin's political background is that as an adolescent in Warsaw, she belonged to the Jewish anarchist populist groups. And while she was traveling in 1910 to Warsaw, she took a trip to visit the great Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin while he was in exile in London, living in a villa. In multiple accounts of Margolin's relationship with Kropotkin focus on how she was picked up every day. She spent every day for an entire month at Kropotkin's villa while Kropotkin's health was ailing. At 68, he had a lot of problems with the English climate. And at the time, she was only 23, and she arrived in London with a letter of introduction from Janowski, the editor of an anarchist paper in New York City. Many of the gossip columns of this time say that Margolin's relationship with Kropotkin was romantic. If so, remarks Faith Jones, Kropotkin, who was 45 years her senior, was another in Leidenbaum's series of intellectual paramours. So basically, the accounts of her contemporaries all say that Kropotkin was exactly her type. But what I'm really interested in here is, what did Margolin and Kropotkin speak about every day for a month? I've looked through Margolin's archives, and she remained in touch with other members of Kropotkin's family. But we know that there was this very abbreviated, very intense relationship between the two of them. And after spending this month in London with Kropotkin, Margolin continued on to Paris, where she cultivated social relations with other Russian revolutionaries, including Vladimir Burtsev, who is an exiled publisher renowned for unmasking agent provocateur. His specialty was in unmasking subversives. And he fed her information, which she then used as a journalist. So while Margolin has primarily been looked at as a nearly apolitical modernist, I think the political circles that she was involved with do really inform ways in which we can read her poetics. In one letter, Margolin describes her complex political and spiritual convictions. Quote, "I haven't ever been able to be secular, even though when I was young, I was a flaming anarchist. I've always talked to God, and in times of sorrow, I admit I gave God hell." The tension that Margolin describes in this letter, her simultaneous yearning upwards and her calling divinity down to account for itself, structures her soul book of poetry, Lieder. The anarchist identification stated so plainly in her letter is also intimated through her verse, submerged with a death-haunted eros. In the opening suite of poems titled Wurzeln, or Roots, the second poem is titled Mutter Erd, viel getrottene, zongewaschene, or Mother Earth, well-trodden, sun-washed. This poem, Mother Earth, projects the poet's voice deep into inchoate space. Aaron Kramer translates to English, and I'll read the Yiddish first so you can hear the rhyme. Mutter Erd, viel getrottene, zongewaschene, dunkle Sklaven und Harren bin ich geliebter. Von mir der Niedriger und der Betriebter wachst du heraus, ein mächtiger Stamm. Und wie der ewige Stern und wie von Sonne der Flamm, kreis ich langen und blinden Schweigen in deine Wurzeln, in deine Zweigen, und halben wach und halben Drimmel such ich durch dir dem heuchen Himmel. Mother Earth, trodden, sunbathed, dark slave and mistress am I, dear one. From me, the lowly, the drear one, you flourish forth, a mighty stem, and like the sun's flame, like the sky's eternal diadem, among your roots, your boughs I wind in silence, long and blind, half waking, half asleep I lie, and seek through you the lofty sky. And I think that here, Aaron Kramer really makes Margolin sound almost like Emily Dickinson, but I enjoy the rhyme scheme that he offers. And Aaron Kramer himself is a very interesting socialist poet. But returning to this poem, Mother Earth. Engulfing the root of a great tree, Margolin's poem speaks from beneath the surface of the earth, half conscious, silent, dark, and nurturing, at once enslaved and empowered. The yearning soil gazes up at what it has birthed. The poem's genealogical motif is established in the line, von mir der Niedriger und der Betriebter, wachst du heraus, ein mächtiger Stamm, which Joseph Leftovich translates as, out of me, the humbled and dejected, out of me, you grow a mighty tree. But the word Stamm here can signify both a tree, an origin, race, lineage, or tribe. Here Margolin avoids unambiguously botanical words such as boim. Instead, she emphasizes and reminds us that all is born from underground. Mother Earth erotically encircles, cries, the roots of a great tree up to its hilt. Norma Fain Pratt characterizes the poetic speaker as, quote, a more androgynous self, one in which male and female are inextricably bound together. But the first person here is grammatically feminine. The identities Tunkelish Glafen und Harin, dark mistress, all have feminine adjectival endings. Aaron Kramer's translation emphasizes the image of sovereignty, such as the sky's eternal diadem. Yet this trope of roots, Wurzeln, winds throughout her book of poetry, Lieder, and indeed its entire first section is titled Roots. In the poem Der Maskerade is Ois, the masquerade is over, Margolin's poetic speaker plainly states, Und ich lieg bei de Wurzeln von Sachen. I lie at the root of things. What does it mean to identify with the root, to lie at the root? This is the primary gesture of Lieder, of Margolin's poems, to lie down, to be still, to be weary, to be death-haunted, and to gaze upwards. Margolin sustains an attention to bodily posture, the one who lies at the root versus the lover who bends over her. In meine Tag Wurzeln und Steiner, my days take root in stones. The poetic speaker may even be dead and buried, watching non-human temporalities of growth from below. Wie mit dine verkrüppelte Zweigen, sie wollten den Himmel gespinnt über mir, über mein Schweigen, was weilt do a weil und verschwind. As with slender, gnarled branches, which tarries a while and is gone, they weave a heaven over me and over my silence. These boughs are anthropomorphized as verkrippelte, disabled, likening the tree's form to the speaker's unseen body below, honoring her silence, her refusal. Again and again, Margolin's poetic speaker renounces the posture of uprightness, whether through erotic submission or to become animal, or to become a tree, like the fugitive Daphne before Apollo, calling us back as well to Devorah Fogel's writing in Train Station, where she calls out to us, be still, become a tree. To become the root is to abdicate from the human, to abdicate human power. The motif of bodily identification with unnationed pre-linguistic earth recurs in Margolin's Mary cycle. Its opening poem, Was willst du, Mari? What do you want, Mary? The poetic speaker declares, Ich wollt gewollt de Fies verwurzelt in der Erde. I would have wanted my feet to be rooted in the earth. This Mary, perhaps mother of the Christian God, commingles with Mother Earth, Mutter Erde. Bin ich ein Mensch, a Blitz, die Umruf von de Wegen, oder de schwarze, krachtendicke Erde? Am I a human, a bolt of lightning, the unrest of roads, or the dark morning earth? In all of these poems, Margolin wonders, where does stillness begin and end? Margolin writes up from beneath the soil. Hers is a poetics of displaced origin, preferring dirt and ruin for company. Margolin thus embraces an anarchist orientation towards the unvalorized, the overgrown, the underground spaces, which remain present even in poems where she heralds marble architecture, for example, or describes or imagines ancient Greece. Margolin's imagistic pleasures coexist with an ethos of anti-heroism. She plays the major civilizations in a minor key, revealing their contingency. Like Markish, the anti-fascist walking with a butterfly alighted upon his heart, Margolin's speaker is aligned and even anointed by dissolving into the more than human world, the unbordered world, the soil without a nation. Margolin and Fogel thematize these gestures of stillness, these postures of recline, as Fogel watches marching soldiers from within the kitchen, as Margolin lies down and reaches upwards, as Markish rests and bellows along with the clouds. These gestures of refusal, when we become attuned to them, can pop up throughout these very paradigmatically futurist poems. It's my hope that by centering Fogel, these new resonances will appear and be heard to us. So in short, my question today, which I have been thinking through, is what will happen when we put Fogel at the center of an account of the Yiddish avant-garde, specifically the Yiddish anti-fascist avant-garde, and how might that undo or loosen our readings of what is the hallmark of modernism? So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Torres. That was very beautiful. It's rewarding and pleasurable to hear poetry be read and read together so dynamically and so cogently. For me, there's a very strong vector running throughout your talk that goes both up and down in both ways very intensely. And I kind of want to start on that note in order to open up our Q&A for that wonderful talk. So I'll probably ask an initial question just to get the conversation going while you all give some thought as to what questions you would like to add to the conversation as well. So while I'm talking, please feel free to write questions in the chat or just write in the chat that you do have a question. And I'll keep an eye on that as well and open the floor shortly. So I guess I was really struck, Dr. Torres, by this illustration, Josef Tchaikov's illustration of the cover of Schwellen, where it's a static image, but it's almost like we can't understand the image without trying to like reflexively act it out ourselves, as you did in the library. And that was such a beautiful anecdote because you both had to kind of embody the conflicting vectors of up and down in order to understand that image. But it also became a social moment because you were then suddenly doing this strange thing in a library, which is an institutional place with rules that you're supposed to follow. And so, I really love the idea of like the complicity of you and the librarians kind of breaking the rules together in order to have what could have been a very private moment become a social moment. So it made me wonder, how, if we do sort of put this vision of mobility, you call it stillness, but I also there's a lot of mobility in the stillness. If we put this vision of mobility at the center of how we are reading, how does it change how we read? So is there like a kinetic way of reading? Is there, we can think of this from the author's point of view, but can we also think of this from the reader's point of view? Like, is there a way to read that somehow enacts or embodies this kind of walking together that you have articulated so nicely?
Yes, and also the special issue, which I've been working on with Catherine Hellerstein and Anastasia Liubas, is actually titled Walking with Fogel. Yeah, and I will put in the chat if people are interested. I just came out a much longer feature on the muralist, Ponizavsky Bergelsen. I'm thinking through some of these questions of what montage means today. Multilingualism is a kind of confrontational visual aesthetic. I can talk more if people are curious or have questions about that project. But one thing that really interested in me was when I asked Ella, the artist, about what kind of music would we set Fogel's poetry to, right? Because it's so angular and so repetitive. She said immediately, oh, techno, this is like German techno. And so the colors that she uses are these really colors not found in nature. Like it really refutes the idea of a natural world or a kind of natural wildness, and instead is really embraces the kind of advertising aesthetic that Fogel was fascinated by. Even as she critiques it, she also takes so much pleasure in neon and the repetitiveness of metropolitan language.
Yeah, it seems like the artist's murals are one possible response to how you could read in a manner that's appropriate to Fogel. And I can't look at the murals without imagining a body getting that high, right? Those murals can't be made without this kind of effortful upward movement on the part of the artist.
Yeah, it's also interesting to think about the elasticity of the text, because I translated Fogel from a PDF that had been scanned, and I only found and held an actual copy that had been printed in 1934 after that research was published. And it was actually very moving, because I realized that there had been one page missing from the scan. Whatever human hand was passing through had missed a page. And so even though something is so widely accessible, there's still something that wasn't reproduced. And the book itself, Fogel's actual text, is printed quite small, like a copy of Howl, quite like a hand-sized. And the artist, Ella Poniszewski-Bergelsen, has never seen an original copy of Fogel, only looked at it through reproductions. And then she blew it up, and she made Fogel eat the entire city block, right? So there's something interesting about it's not synonymous. The poem is not synonymous with its material, but at the same time, Fogel is a poet fascinated by materiality. So the way in which her work circulates has its own material history, its own trajectory. So.
Yeah, very cool. Audience members, don't be shy. Feel free to ask for the floor in the chat, or you can also use the reaction button, which is at the bottom lower toolbar of your Zoom screen, where you see a smiley face. You can raise your hand there and I'll see it as well. I can also go, I can keep asking questions as audience members think and reflect and gather their words. I guess I would ask a question about how commitment to place has figured in the lives of these three authors, and you can answer for one in particular if that makes more sense. You said at one point, and I think you might have been quoting someone else, but I don't remember, that the male experience of mobility has become kind of embedded in the aesthetic of modernism as we sort of summarize it today. And I know that all of our I think all three of our authors were quite mobile people themselves. From what I know, Fogel was able to sort of make the rounds among European cities before kind of returning to where she was from and deciding to commit to Lvov or Lviv or Lviv as her town and as a town she wanted to invest in, and as kind of the right city for her poetics. So is there anything you'd like to say about the sort of literal mobility in these authors' biographies, and also how that compares to how they kind of committed to the places that where they lived?
Yes. So, I mean, in terms of Fogel's biography, right, she was one of very few women who had a PhD in the 1930s. Her uncle was Magnus Ehrenpress, who is a Kabbalistic scholar and a head rabbi in Sweden. And so socially, she certainly did have, access to these different spheres. And the end of her life, she was living in the ghetto, right? Her mobility became confined during occupation. And so I think that, and I didn't speak about that, I didn't really speak about the deaths of any of these three poets, which were each under very tragic circumstances. Markish was arrested, served 3 years in a prison and was executed at Stalin's order. Margolin was a recluse and didn't publish for the last 20 years or so of her life. Fogel was also, right, the victim of fascist terror. And I didn't talk about that, and of course Schultz as well. But I think that there is also a question about these sites of confinement. What happens when we, have many courses which are really wonderful courses that focus on immigration narratives as one of mobility and not of containment. I think there are spaces, for example, the ships that people were traveling in are spaces of containment. The sweatshops, the detention centers, Ellis Island, right, was overflowing with deportees during the Red Scare who are Yiddish speakers. When there's such focus on mobility is what defines modernism in the historiography, it can obscure that mobility is also in tension with containment and the ways that these writers' lives were subject to state confinement. Where is there space to consider that in their poetics and in the historiography? When we think of the immigrant narrative as unidirectional and kind of center that moment of travel, which is also spaces of confinement. And I think that part of what makes Margolin brilliant, and there are of course many things that make her so brilliant, is the way that she's bringing visual, she's kind of thematizing the visual art of her period. And a painting is static, right? And so that's also part of what's being represented, the stasis of visual art through the verbal realm.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that answer. I see that Elaine Wilson has a question for you, and it's good to see you here, Elaine. Thanks for coming. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so thank you so much for this incredible talk. I popped in a bit late, and so as I've been listening and reviewing my copious notes from your beautiful lecture, I've been gathering my thoughts. But something that has been running through my mind the whole time, and I think also through this question session, is this tension between stasis and motion, right? We keep coming back to this idea of these oppositional forces that seem to force them into this kind of frozen place. And this is something I think about a lot as I'm working with Markish for my dissertation. But hearing you center Fogel and this stillness has been incredibly thought-provoking. And I also was thinking about space and how it seems, even with the invocation of these domestic spaces, there's still so much of the public that's there. And I guess in part because I'm not as familiar with all of the works that we might be engaging with, does architecture or like does the domestic space feature in any kind of meaningful way beyond just the bits that we got to hear about earlier on, and maybe I missed some piece of that as well, but I'm just thinking about the idea of like there's that Goethe quote, right? Like architecture is frozen music. Like what a beautiful way to think about this, all this movement that is frozen. And so the common square or the domestic space seem to be in tension, but where do we have more of these intimate spaces? And to some extent, perhaps you talked about this with, confinement and state imprisonment, but somewhere in all of those thoughts, there's this question about architecture and more confined spaces and how maybe that impacts the poetics.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's been really interesting work by Barbara Mann and Avram Noverstern about architecture in Margolin, and they really focus on the marble porticos and her interest in kind of her images of classical architecture. And so that's also part of why I wanted to focus on her image of the underground and the overgrown, because there has been ways in which she is affiliated with modernism because of her relationship to modernist architecture, right? And I think that's just one piece of it. And Barbara Mann's work is really interesting on marble and Margolin. And then with Fogel and architecture, Her descriptions, her adjectives are often related to labor. She refers to the walls as being scrubbed with lye. And so you immediately see the imprint of a person, probably a woman, cleaning them. It's not just a wall as a wall, it's the wall that has been impacted by work, by drudgery. And she has a set of, I think they're called Paris Ballads, where she describes walking through these side streets in Paris. And it's very iterative, one street and then another and then another. And then she sees what you come to realize is probably a bordello, because women are sitting in the windows like sunflowers knitting. And so women become kind of a piece with the architecture there as well through their labor, in this case, sex work, because they're kind of displayed in the windows as though they're like pots, like cooking pots. They're kind of displayed and set there. So there are ways in which woman is almost an adjective for architecture. It's never just a wall, it's the wall that the woman's been scrubbing with bleach. It's not a window with a finial, it's a window that a woman is set inside of, like a frame. So that might be one thing to consider with Fogel. But again, I mean, she's wildly cosmopolitan in this way, right? She's traveled and she translates and she contributes and she has salons, and scholars such as Cornish Meruk, who did survive the war, recount her salons the way that there are accounts of, as you know, Markish's famous public persona in salons as well. But yeah, I think that, one thing that's significant to consider is that it's the building that's being touched in some way. There's a lot of slippage in terms of animacy with Fogel, with her verbs. Objects that have animacy or that are receiving labor. So.
Yeah, that's very evocative, that these walls kind of don't exist in and of themselves without the sort of imprint of human movement around them. It looks like we have a question from Kathy Ferguson. Kathy, would you like me to read this out loud, or would you care to read it yourself? It's up to you. So this is okay, got it. So Kathy is stretching into anarchist poetry to read the poems of Louisiana Bevington from the early 20th century and Rose Freeman Ishill. And Kathy's asking for suggestions for someone who's new to analyzing poetry to think about women anarchist poets. Thanks for the question, Kathy.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I wanted to say, Elaine Wilson, I would love to hear more about your dissertation on Markish. That sounds really amazing. And Kathy, also, I was thinking of your great essay on walking in anarchist practice earlier today when I had a little shout out about Markish's image of walking rather than marching. So thank you for your wonderful work on that. Let me think about it, and maybe I can email you. I think that there is let me think a little bit about that. And I know Rose Freeman Ishill's translations from Yiddish are really interesting, and also thinking of translation as a way to inscribe oneself or bring oneself closer into relation with a radical canon. But perhaps I can email you, Kathy, about that. I'll copy this question.
And I'll give just another call for some last comments or questions. I see Nama Rokem has, hi Nama, good to see you, has a question as well. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Anna, for this lovely talk. I guess I wanted to ask you if you wanted to say more about sort of the effect of this decentering that you're offering, and kind of the revision of the canon in some sense, and specifically I was trying to think more about, I find it incredibly thought-provoking and interesting to think about other kind of parallel cases, what it would look like for other literatures, what it would look like, for Hebrew literature, to put something else at the center and kind of be disoriented in this productive way. I guess I'm curious in particular if you want to say more about the kind of what then happens to anti-fascism, that the picture that we have. I mean, you talked about this, but just kind of trying to understand more sort of the vision that you're kind of presenting here or offering here, whether what kind of understanding of anti-fascism formed the more kind of received idea about modernism, and then how you, if you want to say more about how this kind of stillness that Fogel offers us, what then kind of, what flavor or configuration or yeah, I don't know, choose your your term here, of anti-fascism emerges from that.
That's a great question and really significant. I think part of what I'm struck by is these poems' refusal and the way that they break down heroism. And I think that in some of the proletarian poets of the 1890s and 1910s, who I also adore, of course, this is not shade, but their account of an anti-fascist genealogy is one of valor. And I think that these writers, Fogel in particular, and also Margolin, it's about revealing some of the contingency of heroism and what enables a person to become a hero in a way. And it is a kind of refusal of martyrdom in certain ways. I think if we look, for example, at David Edelstadt, great Yiddish anarchist poet who died of tuberculosis very young, he writes about death is the door to glory in certain ways. I may die, but there will be this infinite ladder of fighters after me. And so there's still an investment in heroics and a certain masculine kind of valor. And whenever I read that poem, I think there's going to be an infinite ladder of children. Like, who's having these children? Who's raising all these generations of fighters? There's no, it displaces, it's an image of heroism that displaces femininity in certain ways. And I think that Fogel dissolves that. And she, of course, I mean, she ran mutual aid systems in the ghetto, right? She was an activist and an organizer in these ways, but her language and rhetoric is about dissolving and making contingent heroism. And so she is satirizing military language in a lot of her writing, the repetitions, the angularity. It's about dissolving state valor in certain ways and refusing to comply with marching or disciplining the body in certain ways. And we see even with Edelstadt and Bovschever, it's a call to action that presumes an able body, that presumes a young masculine body, that doesn't have a private space. Everything is in the street. And so how do those two things work against each other? I'm not invested in saying that there's a single anti-fascist aesthetic, of course, but I think in the historiography, certain things become archetypes. And when I read Fogel, she dissolves them. Kind of the force of her geometries kind of dissolve that. And she and Marcus are kind of, maybe by happenstance, but they're the two poets who live in my head the most. And so to me, there's this conversation between them. And I think the citations that I gave you from Alexander Pomerantz and maybe Goldberg, I forget if I quoted him, but these reviews of Marcus, what's being celebrated about him as an anti-fascist are his calls to action, his heroics, his epics. And so I was interested in looking at these other aspects of movement in which the body dissolves, in which he has a Blakean union with a butterfly, right? What happens when that's also part of his anti-fascism and not something else, when that doesn't get displaced? So that's a beginning to an answer, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think that's a really lucid kind of distillation of the uniqueness of the power of Fogel's aesthetics, and also what we kind of gain insight into another author's work if we allow ourselves to see that first. So I would be tempted to kind of conclude our discussion on that note, because I feel like we just got this nice pith of your whole talk articulated so beautifully. Unless there are last comments or questions, I'll give one last call. Well, thank you everyone for, thank you so much everyone for the thoughtful questions, for the attentive listening. Dr. Torres, thank you so much for that, that detailed and incredibly insightful talk. I really enjoyed listening to it. And I know we're going to have really fun conversations about it in class.
Great, thank you all. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
for
you
your
so much.
comments.
Thanks everyone for coming.